Back here now on the show, talking some more about the defensive side of the ball, more on Malik Hooker and comments about the defense in Dallas because basically he made some comments on Keyshawn Johnson's podcast, All Facts, No Breaks. Previously, when we talked about it, it was a comment that he made on Micah Parsons and him and his, actions off of the field during the offseason about focusing on the podcast, potentially over his responsibilities on the defense. So now he went a little bit further on just the defense as a whole. To give some context about it, their former defensive coordinator, Dan Quinn, he took the head coaching job with the Washington Commanders this year. So Dallas went over and hired Mike Zimmer as the new defensive coordinator. He was previously with the team. He had a stint with them, moved on, most notably with the Minnesota Vikings, but now he's back in Dallas. And Malik Hooker was on Keyshawn Johnson's podcast and talked about the differences he's already noticed and is anticipating in 2024. There was something interesting that I thought it would be to bring up on in this segment was what Malik Hooker had to say of those differences. Basically, he said there is a certain way you have to coach certain guys. I feel like because of how player-oriented Dan Quinn was, guys would relate to him and he wouldn't have to coach a certain way that Zim does now. And he explained it a little bit more, basically breaking down what each of them bring. And I thought it was fascinating, just looking at the differences. Mike Zimmer, he started off with him. He said the way that he coaches already on the defensive side of the ball through OTAs and mandatory minicamp, he basically said that Mike Zimmer gives his players a few chances, to get something right. If you mess up 1, 2 times, 3 times, it's all right. He'll let you have that range a little bit, a average to long leash per se in this instance. But the difference with him is if you keep messing it up and he sees that maybe you're just not getting it, you're just not fitting with his system, he'll take you out, he'll bring somebody else in to try them out and try to fit this mold of his system. Basically, his system is gospel. His system is his system. He's not going away. He's not skewing away from his defensive scheme, his philosophy. It's that way. I don't like saying it's that way or the highway. I just don't like that saying, but it seems like it is that way with Mike Zimmer. He is very dead set on following what he believes will work, and he mentioned it before. I saw an interview that he did, or just a session that he did with the media, that he mentioned that these players are going to have to adapt to his system now. Now that Dan Quinn's gone, yeah, they had success with that, but they're going to have to adjust to his system. So he's very much set on his beliefs, his schemes, and things like that. And he went on to talk about Dan Quinn, and he kept mentioning how player-oriented Dan Quinn was. That was the phrase he used over and over again with Dan Quinn, that being Malik Hooker. He said that, and he related it a little bit to Mike Zimmer by saying if something wasn't right or if somebody kept messing up in a similar situation with Mike Zimmer, Dan Quinn, instead of changing that player out, he'd make it easier and almost simplify it for everyone, or especially that player, to be able to get them to find success in whatever they're doing, whatever they're trying to execute on that defensive side of the ball. Eric says, kind of reminds me of Sean Payton. They usually come from that era, honestly. Mike Zimmer, Sean Payton, Bill Belichick, in a way, also being very set on doing things his way. Those guys, sort of the old guard of these coaches, were very set on their experience, what they learned to be successful, and they weren't going to move on from that. So that's a good point. That's a good comparison with Sean Payton. That was one of the things that was brought up and how everything sort of played out, with Russell Wilson and some of the guys with the Broncos and how they've mentioned it. Sean Payton is very oriented on doing things his way. It's no different with Mike Zimmer, whereas Dan Quinn was a little bit more understanding, a little bit hand on the shoulder, being more, what's the word I'm looking for? Being a little bit more of a teacher, not so much of a sergeant and doing things his way. He was more understanding and changed the way he went about things or how he explained it to these players rather than just changing the player out and trying to find the perfect player to fit his system. And also Malik Hooker mentioned on that point that the biggest difference he'll anticipate this year is the discipline that they're going to have on that side of the ball. And it makes sense, right? If Mike Zimmer is hammering these points down on how you have to do it this way, you have to fit it this way, it has to look the way I'm explaining it to you. If they do it right, they're going to be super disciplined because they're going to know it like the back of their hand, and they're going to be very much tuned in on what is expected of them whenever they set up or in any kind of formation or coverage that they set up in. They're going to know what to expect if they do execute it the right way. So that fell right in line with what Malik Hooker was saying on how different Dan Quinn and Mike Zimmer are. But now I get into this area, these questions of, how successful will this system be for the Dallas Cowboys with not only the fact that it is different from what Dan Quinn brought, but the circumstances around the Cowboys just in general still make me question on how this defense could look, and how different they'll look in just terms of production, and how we could see a dip a little bit in numbers, in stats compared to the last few seasons with Dan Quinn, because once Dan Quinn took over a Dallas defense that was historically bad when he got hired, since that point, they got better in yards allowed and points allowed each and every year that Dan Quinn was the defensive coordinator. In yards allowed, they went from fourth in this first season, then they were ninth in the NFL, then sixth in the NFL just last year in yards allowed in the NFL as a defense. And from the points allowed perspective of this, in his first season as defensive coordinator with Dan Quinn, they ranked 19th, and then they moved up to 12th, and then this last year, they were ranked at 5th in the NFL in points allowed, just in the NFL. So you could see how consistently they got better, really buying into Dan Quinn's system and getting progressively better over a period of time that they knew they had. So they bought into it more and more, and they got better in that time. But where this situation sort of deviates and how it could affect the defense and their performance, in my opinion, is that Mike Zimmer, like a bunch of the other coaches on the Dallas Cowboys, are only on a one-year deal. So will that job security, will the just confusion, the uncertainty around Mike Zimmer continuing beyond this season affect the learning process, the buy-in process from his players on defense? Especially with the way Mike Zimmer coaches, I could see a world where some players can get annoyed by the way he coaches, can just be a little frustrated if they're not getting it and Mike Zimmer's just taking them out. And then from that point on, you can see where it can get to a point where they're upset by it, they're not getting it, they're frustrated with him and his system, and then they start getting into this new field of thinking where they start to acknowledge the fact that he's only on a one-year deal, so why do they have to learn this? And you don't want it to get to that point. That's probably the worst-case scenario when they've given up, and Mike Zimmer has lost the locker room, to just say it in a general phrase. But that is something I do have questions about. If people know that he's on a one-year deal, and if things aren't going well, at what point do these players just, stop trying to buy in and Mike Zimmer actually loses this locker room? And also, it also doesn't help, excuse me, that they lost pieces on that side of the ball, like Dorrance Armstrong, Neville Gallimore, Dante Fowler, Stephon Gilmore, Jaron Curse on that defensive side of the ball. Leaders, more experienced players from that defense over the last few years, they're now gone. So on top of learning a new system, you have to integrate new starting pieces to this defense to try and get everything to fit in a system where there's already, or in a season where there's already a lot of pressure going in to this team with the contract negotiations, with getting over that playoff hump. All those things that play into it. Now you have a lot of new pieces trying to fit it in. It's a lot of things on a checklist of duties that the Cowboys have to fulfill to at least get back to the point where they were last year. So all that bundled into this thing, into this situation this year, I don't think it helps their case for being any better, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where that was arguably their more reliable side of the football. That was their almost backbone of this team with how successful and reliable it had been. So now with all these new changes coming in, I'm starting to question that side of the ball just as much as I'm questioning the offense with the contracts and new players coming in and all these things like that. So It's not all positive, though, just as a last. It's not all negative, though, I should have said, as they do get Trayvon Diggs back to pair him up with Deron Bland, so that's a good thing. But is it going to be enough? I have my doubts about it. Malik Hooker thinks they're going to be a lot more disciplined, at least just based on what he's seen from Mike Zimmer. So hopefully that's the case. Hopefully that could get them over the hump. But even still, they have a lot of questions to answer in 2024. So that is the case with the Cowboys based on what Malik Hooker says. But we have one more topic to get to on today's show. Josh Jacobs just briefly talking about the differences that he's noticed with the Las Vegas Raiders and why he decided to come over to the Green Bay Packers and help them on their quest to becoming one of the best teams in the NFC. There's a lot riding on them, and Jacobs should help, so we're going to get into discussing that a little bit more when we return in just a few seconds.